At sunrise, the Colosseum was already awake. Its huge arches caught the first pale light, while yesterday's blood still stuck to the stone like a shadow. Under the stands, sellers shouted for attention, baskets full of olives and watered wine, ready for a crowd that hadn't even sat down yet. Behind the iron gates, handlers pushed half-starved animals into place, lions with ribs sticking out, elephants stamping in anger, panthers scratching their claws against the bars. From the tunnels came the sharp clang of swords, not practice swings, but tests for the steel meant to kill today. And over it all, a low hum grew into a roar. Tens of thousands of Romans poured in, hungry for the thing their empire perfected better than anyone else: death, all dressed up as entertainment. The Roman arena was not just sport, it was a workshop for cruelty. Emperors filled the sand with fake naval battles, starved wild animals to raise suspense, and forced prisoners to act out myths that ended with real dead bodies. None of this happened by chance. It was part of Rome's rules of control. Cheering from the stands wasn't harmless. It was loyalty shouted loud enough to last through history. And today, we're walking right into that shadow. These are the most brutal, most inhuman arena shows that even Rome went too far with. From blood-soaked funeral games to killing staged as theater, we'll see how an empire built its glory by turning pain into applause. Before we go in, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next trip into the darkest corners of history. Now, take your seat. The gates are creaking open. The first gladiator fight in Rome didn't begin with golden trumpets or emperors in purple robes. It began at a funeral. In 264 BC, the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Scaeva didn't honor their father with statues or prayers, but with blood. They armed 3 pairs of slaves and sent them to fight to the death in the Forum Boreum, a cattle market that stank of dung and smoke. This wasn't entertainment. It was duty, an amunus, a debt owed to the dead. Its roots reach far beyond Rome. In Campania, warriors were killed at graves to calm angry spirits. Over time, killing turned into combat. The dead no longer needed random victims, but duels between chosen men. The Samnites, once Rome's fierce enemies, held such fights often, and Roman elites quickly copied the custom. Burying a man with treasures showed money. Burying him with a blood-filled show proved power. But funerals were only the start. By the 3rd century BC, Rome's leaders saw how these fights could do more than honor ancestors. They could control politics. Religious festivals, once serious offerings to Jupiter, began to feature gladiators. The Senate called it piety, but the people knew the truth. State violence paid for it to keep loyalty strong. Even the armor told stories. Early fighters dressed like Rome's conquered enemies: the Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with a curved blade, the Gaul with a broad sword. Watching them bleed was like watching Rome's victories played again, slash after slash. Death turned into propaganda, and as blood spilled, the arenas grew bigger. Wooden stands were replaced by stone amphitheaters, temples of violence where thousands came together. The games no longer belonged to mourning families. They now belonged to the state. Every drop of blood carried the same message. Rome controlled men, armies, even death itself. No one back then could have guessed how far it would go. What began as ritual sacrifice turned into theater, and duty became obsession. Rome had found a new weapon, power not only over the living, but over the meaning of dying. And once opened, that door was never closed. The roar of the crowd wasn't only for men. Sometimes it shook for wild animals dragged from the farthest edges of the known world. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes dragged across deserts. They weren't shown as wonders of nature. They were thrown in as prey for a carnival of slaughter. Romans called these shows venations, hunts. They weren't about survival, they were about domination, proof that the empire could capture the wild and crush it for fun. Julius Caesar set the tone in 46 BC, parading a giraffe, the first ever seen in Europe. They called it a camelopard, half camel and half leopard, because Rome had no name for it. But that didn't matter. The animal wasn't admired. It was tossed into the sand to be ripped apart. The message was clear. If Rome could seize the strangest beasts alive, then it could conquer anything. The killing only grew. When the Colosseum opened in AD 80, Emperor Titus was said to have overseen the deaths of more than 9,000 animals in one festival. Archaeologists later found bones scarred with marks of forced starvation, proof that lions and bears were weakened first to guarantee a fast, bloody kill. Even elephants, once feared by Roman soldiers when Hannibal used them, were driven into the arena and butchered for cheers. Behind the stage, logistics became part of the show. Exotic animals had to be caught, dragged across deserts, and kept alive only long enough to die in Rome. Caravans pulled chains through burning sands, delivering victims to a city that wanted fresh blood every morning. Caravans pulled cages through deserts. Fleets carried them down the Nile, and handlers risked their lives just to bring living trophies to Rome. Seeing a panther in the wild was already dangerous, but seeing one explode from a cage before 50,000 screaming people, that was power you could see. Every creature was a living souvenir of conquest, proof that Rome's reach had no limits. Some emperors turned these hunts into their own private stage. Commodus, Rome's flashiest showman, walked into the arena dressed as Hercules, killing hundreds of animals himself. He wanted to look like a god ruling beasts, but everyone could see the truth, a fragile ego with a bow. The hunts were usually rigged. Animals were chained, wounded, or half-starved, so the emperor could enjoy a victory that was already decided. And the people? They cheered, not because they respected him, but because when the emperor hunted, silence could be deadly. Behind the noise, a quieter tragedy took place. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder warned that rare species disappeared from their lands after decades of Roman killing. Lions, leopards, even elephants, all pushed toward extinction just to satisfy Rome's hunger for spectacle. The Colosseum wasn't only a theater of death, it was also a wrecking ball for nature. But for Rome, extinction didn't matter. What mattered was showing the illusion that even nature itself could be captured, starved, and destroyed just for fun. Every dead body left on the sand was another brick in the wall of Roman control. When you think of a gladiator, you might picture two equal fighters locked in noble combat, but the truth was far more twisted. Rome thrived on imbalance, on fights made unfair on purpose. They created strange weapons, forced absurd rules, and staged battles no one could ever really win. Some victims weren't even fighters at all. Prisoners and condemned criminals were shoved into the arena dressed as clowns, handed wooden swords, and thrown against trained killers. The crowd laughed and booed as the helpless stumbled and died. Public execution dressed up as sport. Even the weapons acted like characters. The retiarius fought with a fisherman's net and a trident, facing the secutor, whose smooth round helmet was made to deflect the net. It wasn't pure skill, it was suspense, a living puzzle of whether the net would trap or the sword would strike through. Romans loved that tension, even when the fight was as scripted as a stage play. The numbers became more insane. Sometimes one gladiator was thrown against many enemies. Other times entire groups clashed like small armies, turning the arena floor into a swamp of blood, broken shields, and twisted corpses. And when the crowd got bored, Rome pushed further. Female gladiators. Gladiatrices stepped onto the sand in the 1st century AD. Writers like Juvenal mocked them, but records prove they fought for real, against dwarfs, against wild animals, even against each other. Their presence blurred gender lines, but it also showed something darker. No one, man or woman, was safe from Rome's hunger for spectacle. Even the helmets were made for torment. Some narrowed vision or muffled sound, forcing fighters to stumble half-blind while the crowd howled with laughter. Others were so heavy that lifting the head became a struggle by itself. Armor wasn't always protection. Sometimes it was punishment.
And then came the propaganda plays. Gladiators were dressed as barbarians, forced to act like Rome's defeated enemies. Their certain defeat reminded everyone that the empire always won. Every unfair match, every strange twist, every shocking stunt was carefully made to keep the crowd amazed, obedient, and begging for more. The Colosseum never repeated the same thing for long. It kept inventing new cruelties, always chasing the next thrill. By midday, once the morning duels had soaked the sand with blood and the crowd began to lose interest, the arena changed its act. Fights gave way to theater with death at the center. Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. For the condemned, it wasn't a trial, it was a script they couldn't escape. Criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war, they all became unwilling actors in a death play disguised as myth. Each punishment was matched to the crime. Thieves were ripped apart by wolves. Arsonists were burned alive.
Traitors were thrown to lions. Every scene was a moral lesson written in real blood. And the size of it all could shock anyone. During Emperor Trajan's celebrations after his Dacian victory, thousands of captives were killed over 103 non-stop days. It wasn't random killing, it was planned, paced like acts in a dark drama. Every death was shaped to keep the audience tense until the next horror appeared. Animals were the stars of this nightmare. Lions were starved into madness before being released. Bears chained in pits were teased until they snapped in rage. Even prized leopards were unleashed on shaking victims. The suspense, would the beast strike quickly or play with its prey, kept the stands screaming for more. Sometimes cruelty came dressed as legend. Prisoners were forced to act as doomed heroes. Orpheus ripped apart by wild animals. Prometheus chained as vultures hovered above. These weren't just myths anymore. They were bloody performances, and the sand was their stage. Death in Rome wasn't always just death. Sometimes it was theater, cruel mocking theater. For the condemned, dying wasn't enough. They had to act out their deaths, performing Rome's myths with their own bodies. Executions became twisted plays where flesh replaced masks, and the story always ended in pain. The cruelty went far beyond wild animals. Crucifixion, borrowed from the East, was staged right inside the arena. Men and women were nailed to wood while vendors sold wine and children played nearby. Fire joined the show too. Prisoners were shoved into the tunica molesta, a shirt soaked in pitch, then set on fire. Human torches twisting as smoke rose into the sky. As Tertullian bitterly wrote, they were living torches. These killings weren't just sick entertainment. They were warnings, propaganda carved into living flesh. Disobey Rome and you would die slowly, with tens of thousands watching. Not everyone could take it. Seneca complained that midday executions hardened the soul, making men crueler as they watched. But his protest was drowned out by the roar of a crowd that came not for justice, but for the thrill of punishment. Rome's imagination didn't stop with sand and swords. Sometimes emperors wanted oceans inside the city. Mock naval battles, called pneumachiae, were spectacles on a wild scale, where water itself became a weapon. Julius Caesar started it in 46 BC, digging a huge basin near the Tiber, filling it with water and real ships. Thousands of doomed captives were shoved aboard and told to fight as enemy fleets. They weren't actors. They were men condemned to die for cheers. Arrows, catapults, and swords turned the basin into a floating slaughterhouse. Augustus grew the madness bigger. In 2 BC, he built a basin almost 2,000 by 1,200 Roman feet, fed by a special aqueduct, the Aqua Alsiatina, just to keep it full. 30 warships clashed there, each loaded with prisoners, doomed never to leave alive. The message was clear. Rome could command seas where none existed. Even nature bent to the empire's will. By 52 AD, Claudius went further.
draining Lake Fucine to stage another Numachia. When the captives greeted him with the chilling salute, "Morituri te salutant," those who are about to die salute you. The whole empire felt the weight of Rome's power.
History gained one of its most haunting lines. Whether it was practiced or spoken in fear, it summed up the hopelessness of men turned into props. Fire, too, had its dark myths. Victims wearing the pitch-soaked tunic were forced to play heroes meeting fiery fates. Hercules burning in poison, or Mucius Scaevola proving loyalty by holding his hand in the flames. The crowd laughed as these heroes screamed, their bravery turned to ash, their stories turned into jokes. Even the Colosseum's design fed Rome's hunger for control. Under Titus and later Domitian, engineers built channels beneath the arena. The sand could be flooded for small naval shows, then drained for fights the next day. Cruelty itself became an engineering project. Water, fire, flesh, everything was used as props in Rome's theater of domination. To drown captives, to turn bodies into living torches, to twist myths into slaughter. That was power. The emperors weren't happy ruling only men, they acted like rulers of the elements themselves. By the late 1st century, executions were no longer punishments. They were scripts dripping with cruel creativity, twisting cultural legends into weapons of humiliation. Take the games that opened the Colosseum in AD 80. The poet Martial recorded an actor cast as Orpheus, the musician who tamed animals with his song. In the myth, creatures sat enchanted by his lyre. In the arena, a bear was released mid-performance and mauled the singer to death. Art turned into parody, beauty turned into butchery. Another victim was forced to play Daedalus, the inventor who escaped Crete on wings of wax. Suspended on a crude device meant to copy flight, he soared for a moment before falling to the beasts below. Martial joked, "The man must have wished for real feathers," a poet's chest hiding a man's fear. Perhaps the most grotesque of all was the myth of Pasiphae, cursed to desire a bull. One show staged her infamous union with a mechanical beast, followed by a killing that mixed execution, humiliation, and filth. A warning about pride became public disgrace. The message was clear. Rome owned its myths just like it owned its people. Heroes, villains, kings, queens. None were safe from being turned into props for a pageant of death. For the spectators, these scenes were sideshows between serious fights. For the condemned, they were slow, painful ends dressed in costumes. For Rome, they were propaganda made flesh, proving the state could even rewrite the meaning of its own legends. In the Colosseum, stories weren't told with ink or stone. They were carved into skin, burned into bone, and applauded until silence swallowed the sand. The line between ruling and pure obsession blurred until an emperor's whim decided who lived, who died, and how. Caligula, infamous for his savage moods, once ran out of animals mid-show and casually ordered spectators dragged from the stands to fill the gap. They came to watch bloodshed, only to become part of it. Nero, addicted to his own image, treated the arena as his personal stage. Prisoners were dressed as tragic heroes from plays, then executed in ways that copied their scripted fates. Nero called it art. Rome whispered, madness. And then came Commodus, the ultimate showman emperor. Dressed as Hercules, he stormed into the Colosseum with club and bow, killing hundreds of animals crippled beforehand to guarantee applause. He even emptied the treasury for his performances, bleeding the state dry while forcing cheers from a terrified crowd. Still not satisfied, he faced gladiators too, but only when every advantage was rigged in his favor.
Losing was impossible. Clapping was required. Domitian used the arena like a weapon of fear, holding midnight hunts by torchlight to keep Rome uneasy, never sure when fun might turn into terror. Even good emperors weren't safe. Trajan, remembered as fair and strong, marked victory with 103 days of games, thousands of deaths folded into one long show of power. Spectacle fed egos, but it carried a heavy price. Caligula and Commodus both died violently, remembered not for ruling, but for theater written in blood. The arena that lifted them also revealed their madness. Not every Roman cheered. Philosophers, poets, and early Christians left a quieter record, one that saw decay under the marble. Seneca admitted the midday executions hardened him, stripping away kindness instead of cleansing the soul. Violence, he warned, leaked out of the arena, poisoning daily life. Cicero, decades earlier, praised courage but condemned cruelty for its own sake. Yet even he admitted the mob demanded games as proof of generosity. To rule meant feeding the beast. For Christians, the amphitheater was both persecution and proof. Those who refused to deny their faith were thrown to lions or burned alive, their deaths twisted into mass amusement. Tertullian called the shows seeds of cruelty, accusing an empire that cheered injustice as sport. Money, too, was drained. The games ate up fortunes. By the later empire, rulers bankrupted themselves, chasing spectacles big enough to outshine those before them. What once showed strength became an act of desperation. Culturally, the hunger dulled Rome's edge. Citizens who once valued discipline now wanted cheap bread and endless circuses. Juvenal mocked this craving with the phrase panem et circenses. To him, the love of shows revealed how far Rome had drifted from its republican roots. As borders cracked and money ran out, the arenas fell apart. By the 5th century, the Colosseum, still massive, stood empty, its sand silent, its roars gone. But the moral questions never left. Could a society that trained its people to enjoy suffering really last? History's answer suggests no. Today, the Colosseum still stands, scarred but proud. Walk through its tunnels and you might hear echoes, iron clashing, beasts roaring, 50,000 voices shouting as one. The stone is easy to admire. Harder and more honest is to remember its purpose. Cruelty practiced until it felt normal. Rome's arenas weren't just about blood, they were about control, shaping how people thought, laughed, and obeyed. Every hunt, every execution, every myth reborn in screams served the same end: to make power look eternal. And that is the warning carved into the ruins. A civilization that celebrates violence will crumble beneath its own applause. So tell us, which of these spectacles, the hunts, the human torches, or the emperors drunk on their own shows, best shows Rome's darkest soul? Drop your thoughts below. And if this journey into Rome's brutal entertainments gripped you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next dive into history's shadows. Until then, remember, the Colosseum may be quiet now, but its echoes of cruelty still breathe through the stones.